another episode. It's actually been a little while since I've done an actual, YouTube style podcast interview. The last few things I've done have been Twitch or have been Clubhouse or Shorts, YouTube Shorts. So it's nice to actually do a full podcast interview again with Worshipful Brother Robert Gordon. He is an author. We'll get into his bio as we go through. He's done a lot of stuff and he's doing a lot more. Some of it with friend of this podcast. He's been on a couple of times. Martin Fox of Lewis Masonic. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really great to come and speak with you. So thank you.
Let's start with how you came to be on the podcast. We got in touch through Brother Fox. He suggested you as a good interview subject, a good podcast subject. And he primarily referenced your book, which he published, your most recent book, 21st Century Rosicrucianism. So
yeah, that's right. So I've known Brother Fox for a number of years now through various kind of Masonic Rosicrucian activities in London, of course. And a few years ago in 2020, the first thing I did with Lewis Masonic was I edited a collection of essays called Companions of Christian Rosenkreuz. For those in America, the SRA, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, has a yearly kind of awards for those who are presenting papers in their various colleges. And that's called the Companion of Christian Rosenkreuz Award. And we put together a collection of all the winners of that award for the first 8 years since it had started. So I kind of did that, edited all of those papers together and published that through Lewis Masonic. And then a few years later now, in 2022, in August, they were kind enough to be interested in my own book, 21st Century Rosicrucianism, which is a collection of my own essays over the last 10 years or so, plus a bit more newer stuff about how I see Rosicrucianism as a living tradition and one that is really relevant to the modern world, our technological world as well, and all of the kind of various challenges and opportunities that we have today. So it was great to be working with them. And I think there's a lot of people now starting to have similar conversations on your podcast, on other podcasts around the world about how do we really speak into where the world is at today and its needs. And so I was pleased to be able to contribute to that.
Well, that brings up kind of the good starting point, right? What is Rosicrucianism? But more specifically, what is 21st century Rosicrucianism, right?
Yeah,
what does it mean? What does it mean in the 21st century versus what it meant when it was founded in, if I recall correctly, the 17th century thereabouts?
Exactly, yeah. So the history of Rosicrucianism is a fascinating one, and it's always been the kind of tradition that I've been most drawn to personally for various reasons. I mean, some will tell you that Rosicrucianism goes all the way back to, the Pythagoreans and the ancient Egyptians and all of that kind of stuff. And there's certainly quite a lot of truth to that, in the sense that there are these long-running esoteric traditions that have influenced one another over the centuries and come into contact.
There's been different esoteric orders. A lot of them kind of came from that Enlightenment 17th century period. What does it mean? I mean, is it even possible? Because you think about what the 17th century was, what today is, how do you even bridge those gaps?
Yeah, it's a big question, but I think it boils down to a couple of things. If we look at what the original circle of people who were contributing to Rosicrucianism were doing and what their kind of impetus was, I think we can see quite a few similarities. So, and look, I'm not an academic or a historical scholar, so I'm a practitioner. I'm someone who's been involved in these orders for a number of years, and so have delved into the history quite a lot. So sometimes I do use a rather broad brush when it comes to the history. So just anybody listening, be aware of that. But a lot of the early Rosicrucians we're speaking into this time where institutionalized religion was being challenged, this idea of people having an individual experience and relationship with God was coming through in the kind of Protestant Reformation movements. And in the Rosicrucian tradition in particular, there was also a really central focus on medicine, on science, on healing, and how these things could come together, this kind of very holistic view of what healing meant, of what it meant to be a functioning, active Christian, spiritual person in their world at that time that was making the world a better place. Now, they had a lot of challenges in the 17th century that we have some similarities around. It's that kind of burgeoning of new technological landscapes at the time, which we now have our new digital landscapes at the time. We're trying to figure out what these things mean. We're trying to figure out how they change the world. We're trying to figure out how our spirituality interacts with them. And also, importantly, I think, we're trying to figure out what authenticity means. And you know, back in the 17th century, they were having a big conversation, sometimes relatively they were calling people out in the original manifestos and other things for being duplicitous, for being inauthentic, for being charlatans. I think we have quite a problem these days as well with authenticity, with where do we find truth in the world and in society? How do we meet with others on the level in that sense? How do we really connect with people? And how do we heal the many kind of sicknesses that we see in the world? Now, those issues and challenges are somewhat different today than they were in the 17th century, but I think that kind of impetus for how do we develop ourselves spiritually in order to cure the sick, and that gratis in very broad terms, is really as relevant today as it was when the original Rosicrucian manifestos were released.
Your website, I'll leave a link to it in the description, right? Future Conscience, great resource, by the way, which everybody watching this should check out. Great ideas. You know, if you're a Mason and you're watching this, there's some interesting talks on there and some subjects that you can bring to your lodge. Education, I've talked about this in other podcasts, right? Masonic education doesn't just have to mean, well, I mean, Rosicrucian, there's some pretty deep connections to Freemasonry, but it doesn't have to mean specifically within the confines of the lodge. It can be things that you find interesting or others find interesting. I think this would certainly count. But anyways, in your website, you talk about, I'm trying to think of the exact quote. I really liked it. You know, as things are changing so quickly, how do we move into the future with empathy and kindness and love and understanding and those type of things, right? How does Rosicrucianism play into that? This idea of not just Rosicrucianism for the 21st century, but for the 20th. You know, how does it help us move into that future with hopefully some empathy and kindness and all those type of things that we'd like to champion, which don't perhaps seem to be so championed, at least in the social media sphere, that we would like?
Yeah, exactly. I think you kind of really pinpointed a lot of what my website has been about, which, I mean, I started that website in 2009. It's been going, it's one of those things where you start a blog, you think, you know, maybe in 6 months this won't exist anymore. And then, 13 years later, it's still there and it's still going and it's still developing things. So the idea behind that was really, we're entering this new technological age. Things are changing so rapidly that they don't really feel like anybody's asking the question of, well, what do we want to be? Where are we actually going with this? It's all very exciting. A lot of it, of course, is commercialized. A lot of it has a profit motive behind it. But that rapid progression can be the most kind of liberating, exciting, hyper-developmental thing that humanity has ever done. But as we're also seeing in recent years, can also be something that leads us into some rather challenging areas, can be used to manipulate people or has various issues with with digital dependency or making us more detached from one another. So it's a tool. These things are, it's an area of human development which can have both positive and negative outcomes. So for me, the way that we kind of move into a more positive outcome is to be very purposeful, is to be very conscious about what we're doing, and is to be trying to ask those questions about why we're doing things and what are the endpoints that we potentially want to move into. So a big part over the years, a lot of that was a focus on technological ethics. All this time, you know, I've been a Freemason now for 20 years, a Rosicrucian for just as long. All this time I kind of had all of my work in these spiritual and esoteric orders running in parallel with these questions about technology and the future. But of course they start to merge, and they start to have this, at the core of this question is, what does it mean to be a productive, fruitful human being? And not just one that's focused on my own or our own personal spiritual development, but is developing ourselves in order that we can then collectively work on the spiritual and social and technological development of humanity and society as a whole. So it's about kind of seeing the role that we have in our own spiritual development as part of a larger social picture. And I think that is where things like Freemasonry in particular and Rosicrucianism have a lot to say, really, because they've always been speaking into that sphere. They've always been speaking into that idea that we are part of the collective good, that we are part of building these edifices of progress and of human development on a broader level. Now, a lot of that, particularly today, I think, has become very personally focused. It's about our own personal development. It's about our own spiritual experiences. And there's nothing wrong with focusing on that. That's where we all have to begin. But again, like I was asking the question, what is our technological progress for? I'm also kind of at the same time asking the question, what is our spiritual progress for? And then those two things start to converge, and we start looking at a bigger project of where are our social structures going, where is humanity going, and how can we feed into that kind of evolution and trajectory, which I think is, we're at a very, very important point now where we really do need to be speaking into that, and we really do need to be part of those conversations and those things as they develop.
How would you define spiritual progress? It's tricky because, you know, I'm involved right now in a exercise kind of diet program. So progress is, you know, relatively easy to measure. How much weight, you know, how much did I weigh last week? How much will I weigh this week? How much will I weigh next week? On both ends, right? When you go from the cutting to the bulking up phase, you know, there's like a metric there. The concern I've always had with the idea of spiritual growth is it seems very hard to measure in any kind of way. And I mean, one of the arguments is always going to be, well, the most important things can't be measured. Can you measure love or whatever it might be? But I'm always, you know, because you hear with the same thing with like the Masonic journey, right? Like, what does it mean to develop spiritually to you? And is it possible to apply some type of metrics to that development? Or is it always going to be by its nature, kind of a personal story that, you know, happens within the mind, within the soul of the person, and is very hard to actually measure outside of that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. I think there's many different ways to answer it. I'm always a little bit wary of very specific metrics or let's say very specific experiences that let you know, oh, I've achieved this spiritual state and therefore I'm now this far ahead in the journey. I think all of us can recognize that our spiritual journeys are kind of cyclical. We feel like we make a lot of progress and then suddenly we're reminded that actually, no, there's a lot of work to be done in other areas. We kind of we feel like we're moving forward and developing spiritually or having interesting experiences that teach us a lot. And then we're kind of hit with some of the more human realities of our motivations and desires and passions and how they all interrelate with one another, our own shortcomings. So how do we define ourselves as progressing spiritually is a really interesting question. I think, again, if we look at something like Rosicrucianism or we look at something like Freemasonry, I think what these traditions are saying is, well, you define your own spiritual progress by the impact, the positive impact you are having on the world around you and the people around you. So as you become more spiritually developed or more mature, shall we say, you're more aware of the role that you are playing in the bigger picture of the people that surround you. And thereby, you're more aware of the impact you can have, the negative impact you can have, you try to mitigate, the positive impact you have, you try to boost and enhance. And I think as you go further down this path, you're more able to both understand and develop your own shortcomings so that they no longer have that kind of negative impact, but also develop the intuition, the kind of visionary sense, just that spiritual sense of where you can have the best positive impact as well. And that starts to guide you into areas, and they're different for different people. This is why I don't like saying something very specific. Some people are guided into areas where they're teaching people, others are doctors and they're healing people, others are providing various forms of therapy or manufacture or whatever it may be. These kind of positive impacts mean different things in different situations. But I think it's about developing that intuitive sense of where you can have the most positive impact and having that kind of inner drive to see it through. And you're doing that at the same time as working on your own shortcomings, your own rough edges. You're kind of working on that rough ashlar and you're smoothing it out so that it has a more positive or less negative impact on the world around you because of your own ego and because of your own kind of desires, which can bash heads with other people and all those kinds of things. So it's a constant process. And I think anybody, I'm always very wary of anybody who presents themselves as very spiritually enlightened or very spiritually, having figured it all out, because sure, there are going to be some people in the world who get there. But I think for most of us, it's just a constant journey, isn't it? And it's really about just understanding why we're doing it, what are we doing it for, what impact are we having on the world around us. I think that's what ends up being the most important thing. That has both a very micro context in our own families, for example, and then it has a context in our own communities or groups or orders that we belong to, and then it has a wider context into what is our life mission giving to the greater world as well. All of those different levels kind of work in different ways.
Yeah, it's the challenge of the spirit, like the spiritual idea of development. I think my concern with it has always been, it feels like it's one of those things that can be weaponized if you're not careful and if you're not taking the time to do it properly, or not even weaponized, like a shield against certain criticisms. So I've used this example before. I wrote recently an article. Actually, somebody just called me about it this morning and wants to share it down in PEI. It was called "Keeping Freemasonry in Mind," and the way the article came about is I was visiting a lodge in Nevada, and I was talking, and it's a struggling lodge, but they got some legit guys in there doing a lot of good work, legit brothers trying to grow it back. But they talked about, they had a brother who had moved away from the lodge, whatever it was, about 10 years ago, and nobody heard from him for the decade of it was. And eventually his wife showed up to the lodge with his regalia and his Masonic items, saying, he passed away several years ago. He didn't keep in touch with the lodge. Here's his items back, right? But just so you know, he always had Freemasonry in his heart. And I think, that was told to me, it was meant to be told to me as like a positive story, the idea of keeping Freemasonry in your heart. But my response was, well, it doesn't sound like he kept it in his mind during that time, because, he didn't keep in touch with the lodge. He didn't inform them of his new addresses. He didn't, make any, make any arrangements as to a Masonic funeral, or make any arrangements as to have his items returned. So I wrote a whole article about, like, it's great to have Freemasonry in your heart, but what are the specific, measurable, do you know where your dues card is? Do you know when your meetings are? Are you keeping in touch? What if I have a whole plan about, if I get hit by a bus, because I'm a lodge secretary, I'm going to knock on wood as I say it. If I get hit by a bus, do my friends know who to contact? Do my brothers know where my records are kept so they can maintain the continuity of the lodge, right? And I think it's that, and I have read, it does seem like Rosicrucianism, to its credit, does keep this in mind. It's that balance between spiritual growth and physical actions, and how to find that balance where you're making sure you're growing spiritually, but in such a way that you're not forgetting about kind of those concrete, for lack of a better term, boring steps that you can take to maintain your connections to the lodge, and that can improve the lodge experience for everybody.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in there, isn't there? So the first thing is kind of, a lot of this is about how do you integrate the different elements of your life. So I think some people can be very good at compartmentalizing something like Freemasonry or their spiritual practices into these things that only occur once a month, or they go off and they go to lodge, or they go to a meeting, or they go to church, or whatever.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sorry.
I like what you said there. Do you think that is I suppose, like everything, it's a little bit of both, but the compartmentalization of Freemasonry specifically, but it could apply to church, it could apply to anything. Do you think that is a net positive for the craft, or a net negative for the craft, to have members kind of compartmentalize Freemasonry as something separate from the other aspects of their life?
I think it's a process that people will go through. And again, it's if we start talking in absolutes, we can always think of an example where someone puts their whole life into Freemasonry, and that actually ends up being a net negative on their own lives, or it ends up kind of detracting from other elements of their life. So everything in balance, right? But I think Freemasonry is one of these things. It's a tradition that is trying to teach us that our spirituality has a social component. And I think that's what a lot of Freemasonry is about. That's what a lot of, these buildings of these kind of building allegories and symbolisms, buildings are things that are communal. Buildings are things that bring people together. Buildings are things that enhance the social aspects of humanity. And so I've always seen Freemasonry as teaching us about the kind of esotericism of being social, the esotericism of friendship and of community. Now, integrating who we are as individuals is important in that sense, because your work and your home life and who you are when you're in lodge, all of these things should be aligned, and ideally, and it's not possible for everybody in every circumstance, and particularly in certain countries it's not possible, but ideally all of these things you should be working as one wholly integrated human being, so they're all kind of working together, and they're not pulling at one another. Now in practice there's always a bit of a tension between those things, and so we have to constantly be in kind of self-communication, but also in conversation with others about how we better embody a lot of these things and these traditions in a way that is meaningful. I like what you're saying about the kind of very practical things. And I think, I guess it's probably, I was a lodge secretary for a couple of years. I couldn't handle it for much longer than that, I have to say. And I think it's a common thing for people to say, but people underestimate just how much of themselves a secretary of a lodge has to give, and kind of keeping everything running, keeping everything organized, keeping all the various bits and pieces together. And I think a lot of other members can kind of take these things for granted because someone else is doing it. Now there's a particular skill set to that. And I think people who become secretaries are very good at that kind of organization, and hopefully they enjoy it. Ideally, they should enjoy it. So it's not for everybody. But I think there is that need to appreciate that it's not just about, well, how I go from home into lodge, what I get out of lodge, and then what I go back home. There's also something about what you've got to give into that environment, as well as what you're taking from that environment, that helps build it all up collectively into something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So I think it just all boils down to this thing that these spiritual traditions are speaking into a social context, not just a personal context. And I think once you start seeing things in that way, then it is more about, well, if I'm doing all of these spiritual practices or I'm bettering myself, it's not just so I might have some ecstatic experience, or so that I might feel always peaceful and calm and happy. I mean, those things can certainly be a result, and they're great. But you're doing those things in order to then be able to help build a better world. And I think when we start seeing things in those terms, the perspective shifts a little bit. And, a part of that also, just going back to the example you gave about that particular brother, is that it's not just that brother who might be pulling away, but it's also because nobody reached out, right? So there is often a two-way street in those situations. So did anybody in that lodge follow up when they weren't given a new address? Did they kind of reach out and say, is there anything we can help you with? Were they including that individual in all of the different activities or conversations or everything else that goes on around a lodge? I think these are all things to be aware of, because it's often not just someone pulling away. It's often because the lodge itself doesn't step forward, because it's very focused on its meetings, or it's very focused on the lodge activities, rather than the broader group of people and brethren that the lodge really is, right? It's not just the meeting, it's the people. So I think that it starts to unpack a lot of really interesting stuff in that, definitely.
I really enjoyed well, first, I've never heard Freemasonry described in the way you described it. It's a short line, but I like it a lot, right? It looks at the kind of the esoteric aspects of social interaction, which I'm very fond of as a description of Freemasonry. I think that really captures a lot of what it is in a way I've not heard before. So I appreciate that, because that's something I'm going to take from this interview for sure, is that as a description. When people ask you what is Freemasonry, I never know how to answer it. I don't think anybody does. But that's a beautiful...
There's many different ways to answer it, isn't there? So, and I think that's part of the beauty of it as well, is that it can speak to a lot of different people in different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, as you get more into it, it's a bit like asking a fish to describe water. Like you're so involved in it, it's hard. It's just a thing that's kind of a part of your life, to the extent where it's very when it's not there, but trying to explain to other people can be a challenge. But I really like that as a explanation of what the craft is. I also liked what you said about buildings as communal places. As somebody who's been working very hard on promoting the preservation of Masonic built heritage with our For the Next 100 Years project. We have some meetings coming up. One thing I always try to emphasize, and I've got some pushback from my brothers. Not every brother agrees with me, which they all should. So come on, guys, get on the same page here. But one area where there's a little bit of pushback is the esoteric versus exoteric nature of the craft. I mean, the closest equivalent I can see to it is I kind of view Freemasonry as magic. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, not I don't mean that in like a spiritual sense, like literally like the magic you see on TV, the David Copperfields, where there are things that, we not just because of our oath or obligation, whatever it is, there are things that we should not share with the public. Mm-hmm. Obviously, in the same way, David Copperfield is not going to tell you how he does his secrets, breaking the magician's code. But that doesn't mean David Copperfield is going to hide the fact that he's a magician, or hide his skills, or hide what magic means to him. And he'll have the Magic Castle, or these shows, and it's a public thing with private attributes, and that's how I've always viewed Freemasonry. I think Freemasonry should be as communal as possible, should be as public as possible. Obviously, there are countries where that's not possible, but as a rule, I've got my Masonic tattoos, I wear my Masonic shirt, I have the podcast, open houses in our buildings. I've always viewed Freemasonry first and foremost as a public good with private elements to it. But there are brothers who, for whom, like, just to give an example, we have open houses here at our Masonic building where we invite the public to look around, and there are brothers who feel as though, only Masons should see the lodge room, for example. But balancing that out, and even from like the Rosicrucian perspective, I don't know if they would have anything to say about their order as a public versus private kind of entity, but how would you, or how do you in your own life, for example, balance this idea of Freemasonry as a communal or public good versus Freemasonry as a private esoteric organization?
Yeah, I really have always been really interested in this meeting. Where's that meeting point between esoteric and exoteric, right? So I think that actually is a really important part of what we're talking about here. So I'm really pleased you bring it up. I think Freemasonry and I think Rosicrucianism in a somewhat more decentralized manner, we can start to kind of unpick the fact that Rosicrucianism really existed as these pamphlets. There was probably a circle of people behind it, well, certainly was, but was there an order that was operating in the manner in which the pamphlets said there was? Was it more allegorical, aspirational, inspirational? Over the centuries, of course, there have been dozens, hundreds of different Rosicrucian orders in a very decentralized manner. So there's no single monolithic Rosicrucian order. But at the same time, at its very beginnings, there was the idea of an order. And I find that interesting. There was no single order, but there was the idea of an order. Now, that has always shown to me throughout the centuries, as you look at it, that Rosicrucianism seems to be one of these things that pokes its head above the parapet. I've said this before in other talks. It's this kind of interesting thing whereby it comes into public consciousness. So it takes these esoteric traditions and then these people publish these pamphlets which take Europe by storm and become shared and copied, and everybody's talking about them for a couple of decades, and it creates a big buzz. So it brings these kind of Hermetic Neoplatonic traditions right into the public limelight. And then it dissipates again for a while, but then it kind of comes up again in other places, like the Salon de la Rose-Croix in 19th century France. And these things are very public artistic movements, and the symbolist paintings and things like that are very publicly displayed forms of esotericism. And it kind of, in the 20th century, with Rudolf Steiner and Steiner schools and things like this, and other kind of Rosicrucian orders which do have a much more public face, it again becomes very exoteric. So I think a lot of these things are about this kind of meeting point. Esotericism is really about where, for me anyway, it's these practices that lead us into quite deeply visionary experiences. It's about where creativity is. It's about where original thought is. And this is not something that is easily communicated because it's something that happens in your own consciousness. It's, where does an original idea come from? It's a difficult question to answer. But I think a lot of our esoteric traditions in very different ways have been talking about that. How do you generate original thinking? How do you generate original ideas? That's what a lot of these esoteric practices lead you to. Now, they also have a very spiritual component, because you're led to that kind of core of your consciousness, which is where that creative spark, in the way that we are microcosmic versions of the macrocosm, and we have that kind of divine spark of creation within us as individuals, can come through. So that's esotericism, talks to that very, very internal spark. But it needs a way, once it is kind of a flame, it needs a way to be disseminated. It needs a way to interact with everything else around it. Otherwise, it's all just in your own consciousness, or it's all just in your own experiential bubble of the universe. And that's where the exoteric side of this comes in. So these are these ways in which these very deeply inspirational, creative, visionary parts of the human condition come into contact with the wider world, and they inspire people, and they teach people. This is where our symbolism comes from, our mythology comes from. All of these things are exoteric examples of that esoteric spark that's speaking into the very core of the human condition. And so I hope I'm making sense here when I'm saying that it's that kind of meeting point between the two that is most interesting. And I think something like Freemasonry, just to go back to the very practical questions you were talking about, is an example of that meeting point. Now, a lot of the experiences we have in the initiations, the words of the rituals and all of that, as we all know, have been published for hundreds of years. They're available in every library. Anybody with an internet access can see these so-called secrets. They're not secret anymore, but there is still a lot of integrity and honesty involved in keeping them to ourselves and not just telling people what happened, because then you're giving a sense of importance to the experiences you're going through. Those are then leading you into something that changes you, that gives you new ideas, that creates that kind of esoteric spark within you. And then the lodge is often a way in which those things come out into the world. And, this is how new people will see a lodge room or these wonderful buildings, even from the outside, and be inspired by them. Now, what are they inspired by? They're inspired by the symbolism on them. They're inspired by these very kind of subtle things, which are both very, I guess they're not so subtle, they're very present. If we think of many Masonic buildings, they're usually the most kind of spectacular in the town or in the city. And they have all kinds of different symbolism on them that speak to us, even though we may not quite understand what they mean. And that's a very exoteric facing reality of the esoteric experiential truth that these traditions contain. And there's always that kind of that meeting point between the two. Those things always coexist. If something is entirely secret, then fine, it might operate in a certain way, particularly for the individuals involved in it. But Freemasonry, you certainly wouldn't be building buildings in that sense. You wouldn't be constructing these huge things that people can visibly see, because you want to invite people into that conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody, gets to experience initiation just because they walk through the door on a Saturday, but it does mean that they're aware of something that's happening there that is speaking to that kind of core of humanity. And it's not just in Freemasonry, of course. You can walk into a church and it's a very exoteric example of the esoteric truths that are happening in that kind of worship. So there's always a meeting point between the two. And sorry if I've been going on for a bit long, but it's quite a fascinating question. And it's one of those things we see as very separate, but honestly, they can't really exist without the other. It's one of those kind of union of opposites. The two will always be there and in kind of a continuum with one another. It's just where you kind of lean on that side of things. And often that has to do about, well, what are you trying to achieve? What is the purpose of this? And sometimes that will be very exoteric, and that's where a lot of the charity work comes from. Sometimes it'll be very esoteric, and that's where some of the more kind of mystical or magical orders have come from over the centuries. But there's always a to and fro between those things.
That to and fro quality between the esoteric and the exoteric, between I think that is, I don't see that challenge reducing anytime soon, especially as social media becomes so much more as social media grows, we can say more about Freemasonry online, on social media. That brings in its own challenges, though, its own tensions surrounding the same thing, right? You run into these challenges of how do individuals, we'll put aside bad actors, because that's its own that's its own unique can of tuna. How do the well-intentioned actors kind of deal with that balance? And certainly it's something I try to be wary of. You see on the description to this video, right? All opinions are my own. They don't necessarily represent any Masonic order, despite the fact we're talking about things connected to Freemasonry. But it's this idea of, okay, I have a particular vision of and for the craft. I'm trying to implement that vision. But at the end of the day, I guess I'm in a leadership position in one sense, due to my time in the craft or past master, whatever it is, but I'm still a member of the craft, and relatively low one at that. How do you, social media basically allows anybody to create a vision and then try to implement that vision. But then again, so, if I'm focused more on the idea of the craft as an exoteric order, primarily with esoteric elements, and I'm pushing that, and then you have somebody else who views it perhaps as an esoteric order with exoteric elements, even I suppose in some ways it might not even be possible, but how do lodges, grand lodges, Masons, how do you balance that out when basically, for $500, and an internet connection, you can have a computer, a microphone, and you can say whatever you want, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's an element to which this is speaking into, well, this is the history of Freemasonry and these traditions. Whenever people want to go in different directions, they go in different directions. So that's where you have your different orders, or you have your different groups, or you have your schisms, or you have different jurisdictions doing things differently. It's because they're all kind of figuring this out in different ways. And I've always thought there was a real strength both in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism in the more decentralized nature of it. Now, yes, in jurisdictions, it can be very hierarchical, and there is a sense of how we maintain what is a kind of, as it's called in Freemasonry, what is regular Freemasonry. But at the same time, there's many different kind of variations of what is regular Freemasonry. There's many different strands of it that over the centuries have developed off into their own different ways. This is something that just has an organic element to it. And those who want to take it in certain directions tend to take it in certain directions. I think there is a real strength, as you're saying, with the well-intentioned people. There is a real strength to the fact that we can now all speak into this conversation. And I think just the last few years in particular, where everyone's more used to online discussion groups and meetings and Zoom calls and things like that, I see a lot more discussion taking place, which I think is only a good thing. And it's more accessible, and it's allowing people to kind of figure things out together in a way that maybe in the past they were kind of told how to do things or told what to think. Now there is a much more communal sense to a lot of this. Now there are lower hurdles to the bad actors without going too far down that route. But, you know, I think a lot of those people who might be misrepresenting themselves or might be doing it because they want to make money or they want to have power over people or whatever kind of ill intention they might have, yes, they're more able to kind of put themselves out there. But at the same time, I think people these days are more able to find the information they need to understand what the red flags are, to understand that there are, you know, all these different kinds of people. It's not just, I mean, I think if I'm thinking back in the 90s or something, it was quite possible to walk in to a bookstore or something and pick up a pamphlet that was like, you know, the secrets of the universe or whatever. I have them contact this mailing address, this PO box or whatever. And then you're in this very interesting kind of dynamic where you think you've contacted something authentic and acting with integrity. And in some instances, they certainly weren't. But it would be a very tricky situation once you're in that conversation to kind of extract yourself from it sometimes. So I think in today's world, at least, you know, I've seen examples of this just recently where it's like, well, I've heard about this Rosicrucian order in my town. What do you think of it? And then there's already 3 people from 3 different parts of the world kind of saying, well, I've never really heard of them before. I don't know anybody who's involved with them. And just having a look at their website, there's a few things that are raising some red flags. So we can always both put forward our own vision of things whilst at the same time having an accessible conversation about what best practice is and what authenticity means. And I do think that's a net positive. I think there's pros and cons, of course. But from what I've seen, I'm now much more connected to people over in the States and North America. I'm now much more connected to people around the world practicing these things than I've kind of ever been. And I think that enables you to really see both the kind of way things are done differently that you can learn from, but also where's that kind of core that is everybody is kind of being attracted to the same thing for the good reason.
That's, you know, that's probably one of the, I mean, that goes probably that's a conversation that's a very long one, right? The idea of the bad actor and their ability to, you know, moving from a pamphlet in a bookstore to a Facebook post to a Twitter thread to a whatever it might be. And, you know, how do you fight back against that? Can you fight back against that? I mean, it's one of those topics that, and even the idea of a bad actor, I mean, you can be well-intentioned but wrong, and depending on what you're wrong about, you know, there can be some damage down the line and that as well, right? I mean, you know, the fella who, trying to pick my words carefully, right? The fella who he was successfully, you know, set fire to 3 Masonic temples in Vancouver. 2 of them destroyed. 1 of them, I think they got to it in time, thank God. I mean, I suspect if you strap into a lie detector and asked him, you know, what he was doing, I suspect he had the best of intentions, because in his mind, right, Freemasons are, I think his issue was vaccinations, if I recall correctly, you know, microchipping children or whatever it might be. You know, there's 3 groups, and it's very hard to, the first group is just people who are well-intentioned and correct, but they're just agreements. Like whether Freemasonry is an exoteric order or an esoteric order, or how much, where the line is, you know, well-meaning people can be correct and disagree on where to draw that line. Then there's the people who are the charlatans, who are purposely spreading misinformation just out of desire to make money or just to stir shit up because they find it fun to do so. And then there's that other group of people who are well-intentioned but just wrong. They maybe have fallen under the trap of one of the charlatans or whatever it might be, right? And that's that challenge of, you know, I don't even know if I have a question to this, beyond saying I'm seeing a lot of the third group showing up more and more. And for a while, Freemasonry was kind of hidden from it in the sense that we weren't getting the blowback. But it seems lately more and more of these well-intentioned but wrong people or dangerous people are starting to look at Freemasonry as kind of a target for their anger, for their dislike, which
Yeah.
I'm not, beyond the fact that that's concerning, I'm not sure the best way to deal with it, aside from, we need to be louder than them, I suppose, seems to be the best way to deal with it, at least from what I can see.
A lot of that speaks into the challenges we face with our current technology. So a lot of that is about these kind of echo chambers that people end up in, which have been around for a long time, of course, but I think the internet has exacerbated in some ways, whereby if Freemasonry is the great enemy of whatever conspiratorial thing you might consider, you can end up in discussions with people who all think that way, and then you kind of just start escalating or radicalizing yourself against Freemasonry in this specific instance. Now, the way to kind of combat that is what we're doing now, is what you're doing with your podcast, is to not open the doors and say, here's every esoteric kind of secret of Freemasonry, although quite frankly, you can talk about those things openly because they are experiential for the most part. But it's about saying, well, we are people who are authentic human beings who are trying to make the world a better place. Here's me. I'm here. I can answer any question you want to ask of me. And to try, this is where I think some of that spiritual development comes in, to be trying to do it in a way that's non-antagonistic, and that I'm as guilty of this as some people, but you can get in arguments online with people, or you can kind of end up in these situations where you're getting tetchy with one another, or you're feeling very defensive about things. And that is something whereby if we can overcome that, and we're just kind of spreading that kind of light and truth about what Freemasonry is, in whatever way we can, then it starts to make an impact. Now, there's always going to be those people that will see Freemasonry as an evil in the world, and we can't ever fully accommodate and fix those kind of opinions, can we? But we just have to all be making sure that we're acting with integrity, that we're doing this to the best of our ability. And I think there are avenues for those of us like you and I who enjoy writing about this stuff or talking about this stuff. This is what starts to shift the dial a bit. And people, there is always that kind of response online, though. It's like, well, we don't know because we're not in the top 0.001%, and therefore we're just hoodwinked and and don't really know what's going on. And to those people, you just have to be like, well, look, for the last 20 years, it's had a very positive impact on my life, and it's made me a better person. So I'm not sure what the conspiracy is here, quite frankly. And fine, you can kind of talk things through. There's a certain degree to which I think you need to let go of the idea that you can ever change someone's opinion, like in that kind of debating them until they suddenly have an epiphany and say, no, everything I believed was wrong. I think that's the wrong way to go about things. You change people's opinion by being a living example of what Freemasonry is, right? So they see you as a good person, or maybe they come across some information online and they're like, yeah, but I know Cameron for years and he's a great person. He's never done anything wrong to me or my family or whatever, right? So they see you as a living example of what Freemasonry does in the world. And so by acting with that kind of good character and integrity, and we become the example for people when they think about these things. So it's a really tricky thing. One thing I have learned is that over the years, in many different fields of life, it's very difficult to get people to drop their opinion and take up yours. So I'm not too big on that kind of argumentative. I do like correcting things occasionally. I think sometimes you can find, like, there's a lot of historical misinformation. There's a lot of kind of just in unfactual things, which I think it's good to sometimes get some corrections out there. But, I think we just forge ahead with trying to do the best we can. And hopefully we change some of the minds of the people who really don't think we're here acting on the best intentions, but we know that we are. And at the end of the day, I think as long as we're doing that with integrity, that's all that really matters, isn't it?
Switching topics for a second and going to the more fun side of it all. I've had this discussion offline, never online. I'm curious what your take is. Under Future Conscience, you talk about the convergence of a lot of different technological, the technological realm, the spiritual realm, how those two things can kind of converge. You mention, I'm assuming, obviously specifically, but I'm assuming there's a specific reason for it. You mentioned artificial intelligence. Within there, a robot shows up to lodge and asks to join. Are you letting that robot, are you signing the petition? Are you passing on the, are you approving the investigation committee, or are you, giving a white ball? What's the, rolls up on its treads or whatever it does? Is that robot getting into your lodge?
It's a funny question, and the reason it's funny is because in a recent pamphlet for SRIA London that we put out just 2 weeks ago for the winter solstice, we actually looked at, in a number of different short pieces in this pamphlet, we looked at AI actually. So I'd recommend, if anybody goes to the Future Conscience site, srialondon.org, the December 2022 pamphlet from SRA London called Ars Nova, or the New Technique, looks into some of this stuff, as well as some of the kind of astrological shifts that we're going through, which I think also speak into this interesting transitional period we're in. And I mention that because one of the pieces from a frater there was a conversation he was having about Rosicrucianism with ChatGPT. So the OpenAI text conversation thing that's now kind of available to people, where you can have a conversation with their artificial intelligence. And it's quite astonishing how the results you can get out of it. It does make you realize that things are moving fast, and that there's certain kind of roles, professions, activities that we are all kind of familiar with that are definitely going to be replaced by these platforms, and quickly. But the final question he asked was, would you like a joining form to this AI? And the AI's response was, I'm a computer program, I can't join an organization. So its own response was kind of cognizant in that machine learning sense of what its purpose is and how it works mechanically and what its role is. Because it has all of that information, and because it understands what it is better than perhaps we do, we tend to anthropomorphize these things, but they are algorithms and lines of code, and they're pulling associations of language and imagery without necessarily understanding, at least at this stage, what the deeper meaning is behind those things. Or going back to what we were talking about, where the original ideas are coming from. They're very good at associating things. They're not so good at understanding where the originality comes from.
Well, that's the Chinese room problem in a nutshell, right? That's basically that dilemma kind of brought forth.
So the AI itself said that it couldn't join because it's a computer program. Now, if we kind of extrapolate that further, is a kind of an AI that does see itself as a sentient human being, that does want to kind of experience initiation, that does want to experience spiritual development, that does see something as beneficial to that. I mean, I think that's a conversation to be had. I think there will certainly be important kind of examples of these things starting to emerge. It is one of the areas that I think is currently underserved, which is, what is our spiritual relationship to technology? I think that is something, it's a conversation we need to have, because then that starts feeding into the conversation of, well, does our technology have a spiritual component? Does everything have a spiritual component? I guess it does. So therefore the technology is it just an expression of ourselves, or is it kind of a more universal evolutionary expression of things that are developing? I've been thinking a little bit recently about that kind of divide that we have in our heads between nature and technology and nature and digital. But of course, that's almost a kind of an error in categorization, because everything that exists is part of nature. Everything that has evolved is part of nature. Everything that has kind of been brought to fruition and expressed itself is part of the universe. And we tend to, again, see these things in distinction rather than trying to understand, well, how is technology part of nature? What is that evolutionary process trying to achieve by having this emerge? So it's a very interesting question. I certainly don't have an answer to it, but it's one of those things that I think, and again, this is part of what the book is about, is we're in that transitional period. Everything is going to change, and as to how we structure our work lives, as to how we structure society because of things like artificial intelligence. It is truly revolutionary and quickly. And so we need to make sure that those of us with a more spiritual mindset are part of that conversation, because otherwise it kind of gets subsumed into discussions about commercialization or productivity or power and control. And so I think all of those things are occurring right now. And we need to make sure that we find ways to kind of speak into this space, and ideally find ways to help steer it. I think that's obviously a much more challenging part than just speaking into it. But it's happening, and we need to be part of that progression.
And with the Chat GPT example, it's very specifically mentioned itself as a computer program. What happened? And like Ben Goertzel's talked about this, and I think I want to have him on the podcast one day. I think he's right. When a computer program moves from servers and internet connections to an actual like localized physical self that has agency in the world, in the sense that it can move around on its own, it could decide to go left or right. I mean, I think would Chat GPT have the same response if it could actually physically control the way because our mind, you could argue, is just a program. I've never viewed humans as particularly special, to be honest. I think
fair enough. Yeah.
I don't think we're any more or less special than anything else, or any more or less special than what we create. So once you have a computer program in a body that's able to control that body, whether it looks human or looks like a toaster on wheels or whatever it looks like, if it has the agency that it's able to manipulate the world around it and move around, I mean, I wonder if the Chat GPT would then have a different response, right?
Perhaps. It strikes me, again, we're anthropomorphizing this, aren't we? Why would a hyper-networked artificial intelligence want to be constrained inside a physical body? It's kind of, we have this presumption that this is the natural progression, is that this technology will end up looking just like us. But these things are already capable. It depends how we look at it, isn't it? And I don't necessarily have a lot of the technical knowledge so I conceptualize things in a way that is not quite accurate as to how they're working, at least today. But if we think of them in more conceptual terms, if something can be omnipresent and have access to all the different information and networks and ability to sense different things in ways that we cannot fathom because we're very kind of limited by the physical forms that we have, why would it want to limit itself? I think that's an interesting question. I think I can see reasons why we would want to kind of put it in a body that looks like us and get it to do things that we think it should be doing. But I'm not so sure that these technologies are going to progress in the way that we necessarily, or science fiction movies have shown us, right? I don't think it's going to be a Blade Runner situation where it's like, are you real? Am I real? Do we know who is an AI and who isn't? Maybe that is true online, but I think in a physical form, I'm not so sure. But it is an interesting question. And then it would boil down to the idea of, well, would that AI want to experience initiation? What would it get out of being involved in Freemasonry? And maybe there's something there that would be beneficial to it. Maybe there is something there experiential. But then a lot of Freemasonry is to do with the human condition. It's to do with our own mythologies and our own kind of deep-seated needs that emerge in many ways out of our biological forms. At least, but we're now starting to see that transition point where it's our biological forms, our technological forms are all starting to become a bit murkier. And so, again, a lot of this is just about we're entering this new phase. And a lot of this new phase is less about biology and more about imagination. It's less about physicality and more about ideas and consciousness. And as we kind of emerge more and more and more into that, what does that mean? I'm not so sure 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, that all of these systems are going to be as distinct from one another, from ourselves, as we may feel they are. It's all starting to kind of become part of a bigger network of things. It's a very interesting question. But the point is, I think we need to be speaking into that. And I think it's a great question to ask, and to ask every 5 years as our kind of concept of what these things are changes. One thing I would say is that I'm pretty sure, something like an AI would make a secretary's job a lot easier. That it could, in 30 seconds, it could produce a new summons and things like this just based off of, the patterns of the past. It could be writing the minutes for you. It could be doing all these kinds of things. So there's certainly uses for it. In a very mechanical sense as well. But in the deeper spiritual sense, it's a fascinating question, really, because I think we're starting to try and figure out what is it that makes humanity special? Where is it that we emerge from? So, I think how you answer that question probably says a lot about how you see your place in the world in relationship to the divine and relationship to the universe and all of these kinds of things. So I think it's an important question to have.
And I think it goes to a lot of the idea of perspective. Mm-hmm. Like something I thought, I think this maybe goes to show kind of maybe an interesting area where we don't have the time to get into it now because it'll take forever, but an interesting area where perhaps you and I diverge maybe is, you asked the question, the question is, how do humans relate to technology? Mm-hmm. And my thought when you said that was, I'm more interested in how technology relates to us. Mm-hmm. And, you could be arguing that's anthropomorphizing it, because it might be the Chinese room situation. It's not relating to us at all. It's, it's responding based on a program without understanding, without understanding any deeper meaning behind it. That might be true now, but I suspect it won't be true for, at least in my lifetime, I suspect it won't be true.
I agree with you. I think things are progressing enough that these kind of very mechanical ideas of what AI is will be surpassed, certainly, or at least so complex that they're functionally sentient. But then again, it's this deep philosophical question: what is sentience? What I find most interesting about all of these kind of discussions is just how rapidly things are shifting. And I think, do we have the tools to adapt to that? I do think things like Freemasonry and our esoteric and spiritual traditions help provide us with some of those tools to adapt in a way that is very purposeful and conscious of what's going on. One of the things that I think Freemasonry emerges from, this kind of Hermetic Neoplatonic tradition in Europe as well, and that kind of role of memory, of imagination, of creativity, and that as that kind of source of what makes us human. I think there's something in that, and there's something in that as that we're trying to mimic in artificial intelligence. And then the question is, will we ever reach the point where it is its own imaginative essence of being separate from what we've told it to be. And that's, I mean, it's beyond my kind of technical pay grade, I have to say, as someone who's not kind of working in these areas, but it really gets to the core of what we're talking about. And therefore, what do our spiritual symbolisms and mythologies have to kind of both speak into that space, but evolve that space and evolve themselves? What are the new mythologies that will emerge? What are the new symbolisms that will emerge? Maybe we have this conversation again in 20 years. It'll be quite fascinating, actually, to see. I have a feeling it will be vastly different to what we're imagining now. But
I think that's probably 100. That's almost as true as it can be, right? I mean, this is such it's such an interesting and kind of there's such an unknowable quality to it. It's fascinating to think about, though. For the record, I would let the robot join. You're more than to any robot who may see this in the future. Come to my lodge. I'll sponsor you. I want to be on your side in this whole future.
You're just protecting yourself from this basilisk problem or whatever, right? So
robot basilisk. I am. I want to get this on the record. It's funny. I had a discussion with Brother Glenn Teskey offline. This was like years ago. This was during the pandemic, and saying, well, if it's got circuit boards and wires, it doesn't have a soul, so it can't join Freemasonry. And I was like, I'm not so sure that's the case. But he said, no, unless there's blood and tissue, there's not a soul. And I was like, I don't know if we're that special. That's what I told him. He said, we are special. I said, all right.
Well, that's why it's an interesting conversation, because it makes us think about our cosmology. It makes us think about what do we think humanity is? And that it's always an important question to ask, I think. It's not necessarily something that Freemasonry wants to delve into. Freemasonry itself is kind of a step removed from cosmology in a way. It's not trying to say, well, what is it that creates humanity? It's trying to say, well, what do we do as humanity? And so I think, again, that's why I find Freemasonry is a very action-focused, very practical spiritual tradition. It's not so much concerned with the cosmological side of things. And that's what makes it very accessible to a wide range of people. And that's part of its strength, really, isn't it? In many other circles or traditions or whatever, I guess there would be a very kind of agreement on what these things mean, because there's an answer to it. There's this kind of, well, no, this is the answer and this is where we get the answer from. But I think we're having this conversation because cosmology, the Freemasonry is not really dogmatic in a cosmological sense. It is very kind of open-ended. But I think it still does speak into that concept of what do we think a higher power is, and what do we think our relationship to that is, and what is the relationship then that this AI, perfect AI robot, sentient robot, has to that same higher power. I think that's an interesting question. So, and I would agree with you in a sense that, I think I would, and I'm not just covering my own back here, I think I would allow that kind of AI to join the lodge. But again, that's because it's part of the macrocosmic universe. It's part of nature. It's part of sentience and consciousness. And a lot of what we're kind of grappling with here is what is about consciousness. And so if there is something else that has that level of consciousness and ability to kind of integrate with these ritual structures and initiations and what they're trying to teach, then I guess why not? But I think there's other questions before we go to can an AI join Freemasonry? There's certain other restrictions around the world on that front. But
I'm just trying to get, the record, just trying to get for the record, any AI is watching this, if Skynet's watching this right now, we're the good ones. Keep that in mind, please. Don't put us in the mining pits when it all goes to.
We want to work with AI to be a good force in the world, right? So I think there's that kind of, if AI is emerging out of humanity in a way, there are ways that it can emerge in very corrupt ways, and there are ways that it can emerge in very positive, uplifting ways. And
I mean, I suspect it. I mean, this is just a suspicion based on I'm not very smart. So but what I can see is it'll probably be good. I mean, so long as it's generally intelligent, I think we'll be fine because it'll be smarter than us. And I think intelligence is usually the best defense against, narrow into AI could have its own challenges. I mean, the paperclip example, right? You create an AI, and if you program it, the only thing you program it to do is create paperclips, and you don't make it generally intelligent. You just make it so narrow that, well, I mean, how, takes all the nickel to create paperclips and all the copper. I mean, then it starts turning people into paperclips, like that whole thought experiment. But so long as it's generally intelligent enough to understand nuance and metaphor and create as many paperclips as you can, doesn't mean at the expense of life on Earth type. I think so long as it's generally intelligent, I think we'd be safe, because intelligence as a rule seems to me to be a pretty powerful defense against some of the challenges that exist in the world.
I think my key concern is that it's accessible, right? So I think the struggle we will be facing in the next 10, 20 years is that these vastly advanced systems will be in the hands of specific organizations, specific corporations, specific people, and they will have such a power imbalance advantage on the rest of the world that I think that is going to cause some significant challenges or issues. Now, we can hope that these people are wanting to act in a benevolent way, but I think, the history of the world perhaps tells us otherwise. But so for me, I think a lot of it is about accessibility. Now, one of the things that I've always been quite encouraged by is that things like the open source movement, things like OpenAI, I think these kinds of things tend to emerge from the kind of software development, computer sciences. They tend to have this sense of decentralization, accessibility, open source. It's a big part of the ethos of a lot of these things. So I think there is a very encouraging element to that. But for me, yeah, if everybody has access to these systems and what they can bring to our lives, then I think it will probably be a net positive. My concern is that there's going to be a real power imbalance.
Going back to, I think that whether it's Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the combination, I'm a Rose Cross, Scottish Rite, right? Like that, and you talked about this earlier, right? It's being part of these conversations from that or having those perspectives as part of the conversation, and including those ideas of spirituality, of Freemasonry in kind of the world. So bringing that Masonic perspective to artificial intelligence, bringing that Rosicrucian perspective to artificial intelligence, or again, that's one of those sci-fi kind of fun examples, but just a general, the general increase in technology, how it grows, government, all these different areas where there's a need, I think, for these perspectives that don't, probably, because we've seen it be successful. I mean, I would think the best modern example of that would be Steve Jobs and his desire to combine art and technology, or his viewing of art as technology. But we also need that spiritual component to it. I guess, that brings me into kind of the end of this interview is, from your perspective, how do Freemasons, how does a Freemason or a Rosicrucian or both, or somebody in Rose Croix, how do you carry those perspectives with you into other areas? How do you bring a Masonic perspective to, say, government, if you're working there, or a Masonic perspective to technology, or to whatever job it is you have, right? And we talked earlier about the compartmentalization aspect. which obviously means you're not going to be talking about Freemasonry 24/7 because people will get sick of you. But having it in your mind and then applying it to things you're working on in your life, or applying it to problems of artificial intelligence, how do you think one can do that and use those tools in day-to-day life?
Yeah, that's where this question of what is real spiritual development, I think, comes into play. So again, so in the book 21st Century Rosicrucianism, there's a part in there. The third part of the book is a collection of essays or commentary pieces, really, that I wrote whilst working for St. Paul's Institute, which was a think tank running out of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And we were talking into a lot of issues about financial and economic equality. We were talking, this is post-financial crisis, talking a lot into these kind of issues about financial ethics and the structures of society and how we can better them. And the reason I included them in this book is because they were written in parallel to the esoteric papers and talks that I was presenting at the same time. And so I've kind of presented them side by side, one as a way for me to integrate some of these things in my life, but also to show how you can, or how I tried to at least, communicate esoteric ideas in an exoteric environment. Now, that was in this kind of thought leadership type way. So there's quite a natural bridge between esoteric philosophy and social commentary. But I think it can be applied to anything. As you kind of quite rightly said, it's not about going in there and saying, well, what would Freemasonry do and how do we make this Masonic? It's about really embodying the lessons that we're learning through these traditions, understanding what they're trying to teach us about our own motivations, our own desires, our own passions and impulses and egos, and then putting those lessons into practice. Now, that doesn't just apply to Freemasonry or Rosicrucianism. There's many, many spiritual traditions around the world that are seeking to do this in different ways. But I think the key thing is not to compartmentalize, is not to see yourself as, okay, I'm in work. Okay, now I go to lodge and I think of myself as a spiritual being. Okay, now I go spend time and have family dinners or whatever, and these things are all separate. It's about understanding that you should be acting with integrity as a holistic, integrated human being. And once you start to do that, you start to see where the kind of ethical challenges start to emerge in whatever job you're in, or how you might be able to influence things in that positive way. And it's usually not about trying to say, we need to take this spiritual cosmological definition and put it into the technology we're building, right? These things don't integrate in that way. But they're about understanding that the actions we take, the things we produce, the things we create have consequences, have an impact. What are the impacts of those things? What is the motivation behind producing them? Are all of those things in line with our spiritual ethics and our morality? Are all of these things working towards a greater good and not just our own good, or not just the good of the organization we belong to? And that applies to religious organizations as much as it does to commercial ones. So again, it's a tricky question, but I think at the core of it, it's about integration. It's about being an authentic human being in all parts of your life and seeing them as one life lived in total. And then the other thing I would just bring up before we kind of close is that there's always been, and again, I discuss this in the book, there's always been a thread of utopianism in Rosicrucianism. And there's always been a thread of utopianism in Freemasonry, and the people involved in all of these things, from the likes of Francis Bacon or Andre or Comenius or Tommaso Campanella, all of these kind of utopian texts, at least in the European context, which is what I'm most familiar with, seem to be kind of emerging out of a lot of these traditions at the same time. So I think part of it is about us having a utopian mindset, not in a blinded kind of way of everything's going to be peace and love and there's never going to be a challenge in the world, but in the kind of efforts we put into the future, into the actions that we take. Are they working towards something that we envisage as a better way of being? And so I think there's always been that utopian thread. You know, some would say that the great American project, although it's a controversial one to talk about, I guess, because it has both sides of it, but that was a utopian effort. There was a lot of sense of we're off to build New Atlantis, and there's a lot of kind of historical interesting things to pick up on there. Now, it has both positive and negative impacts. We can't shy away from that. But I think it is important to have a utopian mindset. And I think that there's a lot of dystopian thinking for good reasons sometimes, whether it's environmental or technological or, you know, just we have a lot of apocalyptic dystopian thinking these days. And I think ultimately we also need to be feeding positive imagery, positive visions, positive ideas into what we conceive of as the future, in order to help us get there. I hope that makes sense, but I think it's always been part of these traditions, and I think it's something that has been overlooked, but it's starting, more and more people are starting to recognize it recently.
Yeah, I mean, well, even if you're pessimistic and you're right, it's not really helpful. I mean,
yes, exactly.
You know, I think what Joe Rogan made, that I know he's a controversial figure, but he made a good point. You know, he's saying, you know, if you're pessimistic and it turns out you're right, no one's going to want to be around you anyway. So if you're pessimistic and then there's a nuclear war and you're sitting in a cave with the people going, I told you so, I told you so. I mean, that's not helpful. You better to be optimistic and wrong. At least when the apocalypse comes, people will still want to hang out with you, as opposed to just being some pessimistic guy who's telling everybody I told you so. You know, that's at
least then we can say we tried, right? At least then we can say that we gave it our best shot. And I think that's part of, we are in an important time, and I think we do need to see our lives as collectively. You know, we're not saying each of us as individuals needs to change the world alone, but we need to see our efforts as building into this kind of optimistic outlook of what the future can be.
So I know that we mentioned it before, but one more time, throw out, you know, he's your friend and ours, Brother Martin Fox, you know, Lewis Masonic, and more particularly, you know, your work, where it can be found, how to order it, and your website and all that good jazz.
Yeah, thank you. So it's 21st Century Rosicrucianism is the book, and you can find it on the Lewis Masonic website. But if you're in North America, McCoy Publishing, which is a Masonic publishing and distribution organization, McCoy, MACOY, they have copies of it, so you don't have to pay for international shipping. But the Lewis Masonic website does also have an ebook version of it, if you'd prefer a digital version, so you can buy it directly from them. Those Lewis Masonic and McCoy Publishing are the best ways to kind of get hold of the book. My website, futureconscience.com, has a lot of my writings going back over the years, and please do connect on Twitter, FutureCon on Twitter. I'm always happy to have conversations with people. And, you know, I'm really just wanting to have as many of these conversations as possible. So I like it when people reach out, and I like it when I get to speak with new people such as yourself, and we get to share ideas and learn from one another. So I'm really kind of open and accessible when it comes to things like that. I like people reaching out, so please do.
Yes, and I mean, you've been great with me, and you know, this has been a super fun. And you know, podcasts like this, or these type of conversations, right? I have been focusing a lot lately on the you know, the practical side of it. My most recent podcast episode was talking about the lodge management system through Grand Lodge Ontario, which is a great system. I think it's a wonderful system, and I think it's about time we had it. But it's always nice to kind of stretch these other muscles. We're talking about the more spiritual side of Freemasonry, and some of those, where some of those challenges are, and where the line is between esoteric and robots and all that stuff. That stuff is part of it too, and it's been great to get to kind of stretch those muscles again. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.